the i24NEWS studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Tal Heinrich.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Crossroads. Eric Lanskroner is in for David Schuster tonight. Great to have you here.
It's great to be here.
Well, this was another violent day along the Israel-Gaza border. A 25-year-old Palestinian was killed and at least 220 more were injured, most from live fire in clashes with the Israeli army.
Now, the IDF said 8,000 violent rioters gathered in 5 locations along the Gaza Strip border and attempted to sabotage a security fence. The military said an IDF tank fired at a Hamas post in the southern Gaza Strip in response to Palestinians who had infiltrated the border fence and tossed improvised explosive devices.
The violence erupted Friday amid reports that the United Nations and Egypt were working with Israel and Hamas leaders to reach a ceasefire agreement. Middle East correspondent Emily Rose has more.
All signs point to an end to the crisis. Details of the reconciliation plan between the Fatah and Hamas warring factions were reported in Arabic media and include a plan to end tension with Israel and improve conditions within the Strip. Hamas's Saleh al-Aruri's arrival in the Gaza Strip shows talks are at an advanced stage, and Hamas is mulling over a 5-year, 3-stage plan that could go into effect within a week. The first stage would see the end to violence on Israel's border, including the halting of fires from incendiary kites and petrol bomb balloons over the border, plaguing Israeli farmers.
What you see around us is the reality of our lives. Every day we have like tens of fires erupting because of balloons and kites sent from Gaza. And the message or the purpose of it is to terrorize our life.
In exchange, the Kerem Shalom and Rafah border crossings from Israel and Egypt would be reopened.
Of course, banning the fuel and closing the crossings largely affects the Gaza Strip in all aspects of life. It affects hospitals, the agricultural sector, the industrial sector, and transportation. Of course, everything is affected by this closure, especially that it is a sudden decision, closing the Kerem Shalom crossing suddenly without any notice. It affects all aspects of life in the Gaza Strip.
The second phase includes allowance for entry of all goods into Gaza and boosting electricity supply through Israeli power lines. Gazans only have some 4 hours of power a day and suffer from frequent shortages. In the third phase, the United Nations would implement advanced infrastructure projects, like the establishment of a port in Egypt to be used by Gazans and the construction of an airport and power station. But both Israel and the Palestinian Authority have to consent to these terms, what could mean the difference between escalation and reconciliation. Emily Rose, i24NEWS.
In the middle of all this, the White House is also bulking up its Middle East peace team.
According to a new report, the Trump administration has begun seeking employees from other Washington agencies to help advance the long-awaited plan to get Israeli and Palestinian leaders back to the negotiating table. Diplomatic correspondent Eli Hochenberg has that part of the story.
Start your engines. The peace plan is coming. After long months of preparations, a first concrete indication of the finalization of the big Trump deal. The National Security Council reached out to other bureaus in a bid to find more members to join the peace team headed by Special Envoy Jason Greenblatt and Special Advisor Jared Kushner with the help of Ambassador David Friedman. According to an AP report, the growing team will include 3 working groups: politics and security, economy, and strategic communication. The State Department, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, and even Congress were all asked to, quote-unquote, donate quality manpower that will be invested in the peace plan for a time period of between 6 months to a year. While those agencies declined to comment, the National Security Council officials said that Kushner and Greenblatt are, quote, expanding their team and the resources available as they finalize the details and rollout strategy of the peace initiative.
We're all back. How are you? Good to see you.
White House officials were recently quoted as saying that the plan will focus on pragmatic details rather than general and vague concepts. Others were dubbing Trump's plan as the most detailed one ever presented, and that now it is in the stage of final tweaks.
That's true. That's true.
But don't pop the corks on champagne bottles yet, as the formulation of the plan might turn out to be the easy part compared to the next, getting both sides aboard. Eli Hochenberg, i24NEWS.
To discuss, let's bring in Thane Rosenbaum, Middle East analyst here on set, who, if I may add, did you apply? I think you're...
I'm waiting for my call, Tal. I've been waiting for a year and a half for my call.
Are you going to be free over the next 6 months to a year, as Ellie Hochenberg reported? Yeah, you have time for that?
I would love the job, but I don't think they will call.
What do you make of this report? Do you think that it means that the unveiling of the peace plan is imminent, or on the contrary, now they're forming a team, so it might take even longer than we thought?
Well, the reason I wouldn't get a call, and no one does, the reason that no one does is because the truth is that Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt have been flying solo this entire time. Prior administrations relied on Washington think tanks, foreign policy experts, Middle East experts like your friend Thane Rosenbaum, special envoys. That just didn't happen here. These two gentlemen who have no experience in foreign policy have been doing this all on their own. So it's not clear. Of course, they've had staff, but they haven't called out to the foreign policy professional groups to assist them. So now they're actually reaching out. And the question is, what are they reaching out for? Are they reaching out because they need manpower, because they've been short on manpower up until now, or because they're finding that they have obstacles? And the major obstacle right now is that the Palestinians have completely avoided these negotiations all, and they promise that they will not be part of them. So it may be that they're looking for people not just to work on the politics and security, as you pointed out in your report, or economic incentives, but also strategic communications. How do we get the people to start talking?
There are those who said that the coming days would be critical here in the process. Do you agree with that? And do you think that Egypt getting involved and, trying to talk to Hamas and trying to talk to the Palestinian Authority, getting them to reconcile, is that going to have the desired impact right now?
Well, remember, in your report, that really was about ending the violence on these right of return, these protests of return that take place every Friday. And here we have more violence on Friday. It's not clear whether this has anything to do with them rejoining this conversation about a new rolled out peace process. The problem here is everything we know about it, which is, again, it's opaque, we don't know much, is that the Trump plan will be focused mostly on economic incentives. And the idea is that if you can promise the Palestinians an economic future for their people and their children, they will abandon their need for the right of return or even for their claims to East Jerusalem. This is a very cynical approach, and it's not clear it's going to work. There's no evidence that the Palestinians have ever been motivated by money. What they're motivated by is Israel not having a country. That's the most important thing to them. The two-state solution was not something they were ever buying into, because they would have already had a state had they accepted any of the earlier proposals. So the more important thing is, whenever this gets unveiled, could this ultimate deal work if it's not giving the Palestinians what they purport to want, and instead gives them money and incentives? Speaking of money, the United States has been withholding money recently in order to try to squeeze both UNRWA and Palestinians to come to the table. But again, there's no evidence that this is going to motivate them.
But by the way, speaking of money, also this ceasefire agreement also includes a certain monetary compensation for the Palestinians in Gaza, millions in financial aid, to be more accurate. Also, a seaport and an airport for Gaza that will operate from Egypt in exchange for seizing these demonstrations. And also, there's a part that talks about a swap between prisoners, including bringing back the remains of the IDF soldiers who were killed in the 2014 conflict. Do you think it's a real agreement that could actually work? Because the two sides they seem to be taking it seriously now, considering it.
We've been waiting for the Egyptians to step up and take control in some ways, to actually drive the Hamas and the Gazans in one particular direction. It hasn't happened yet. Also, the hope is that there would be some reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, because really, what kind of a peace agreement can you even have if you're only negotiating with the Palestinian Authority? Still, the Fatah, and despite what we saw, the brotherly kisses, they despise each other. These are not people that easily reconcile. And in terms of this restoration of aid, some of that aid comes from the Palestinian Authority itself, because they too have been squeezing the Gazans with respect to electricity and other infrastructure money.
To your point a moment ago, is there really any deal that is going to be sufficient or good enough for Hamas, which, as you said, it wants to rid Israel, or as they call it, ridding Palestine recently of the filth of the Jews? This was a senior leader.
Yeah, I mean, this is really what the cynicism of this new plan is that they can be bought off. You know, we think about this in the United States, you know, very, very tortured analogy, but Native Indian Americans, they have their own reservation, and you give them licensing to gambling and say, okay, this is how we deal with you. That's not going to work. This is not what the Palestinians are interested in. They don't want their own reservation, and they're not interested in hotels. What they're really interested in, they actually are more interested in flying incendiary balloons and arson kites. To them, anything that destroys the future of a continued Jewish state is what's their primary on their mind.
And to me, it's very interesting that the fact that Israel is somewhat talking with Hamas through Egypt. Where does it leave the Palestinian Authority and President Abbas? Well, Thane, we're short on this, but thank you very much. And also let us know if you try to apply, you know.
I'll always come back to you.
All right. Still ahead here on Crossroads, Iran's economy is bracing for a hit as new U.S. sanctions are set to take effect following Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear agreement.
Plus, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo pressing Turkey again to release an American pastor, warning the clock has run out. Welcome back. Syria's army is preparing for a major battle in the northwest territory of Idlib. It's the last major opposition enclave in Syria.
The battle for Idlib comes as Assad's forces retake control of the last remaining rebel stronghold in the south. Defense correspondent Daniel Tzemach has more.
For the first time in 6 years, UN peacekeepers and Russian forces patrolling the area between Syria and Israel, as the latest sign that the war in Syria may be coming to a close.
Reconnaissance of the M7 road conducted by Russian military police jointly with UN representatives today will allow the delivery of humanitarian goods to the refugee camp in Zivan and allow the commander of the UN forces to inspect posts that are located along the Alpha Line, which is under the control of the Israeli government in the territory of the Golan Heights.
But just over a day ago, 7 armed jihadists treaded through Israel's demilitarized zone between its security fence and Syria. No more than a mile away from Israeli border communities, the first breach into Israeli territory since Syrian President Bashar al-Assad reclaimed the Syrian territory bordering Israel, once held by rebel groups as well as ISIS.
From our point of view, the situation is returning to what it was before the Civil War. That means there is a clear address, there is responsibility, and there is a central government.
But this attempted infiltration brings another security threat to the forefront for Israel. ISIS militants making last-ditch efforts to cause as much destruction as possible before being completely removed or taken out. Another concern for Israel when it comes to its Syrian neighbor, Iran. Recent agreements between Russia and Israel suggested that Iran would be no closer than 85 kilometers to Israel's border. But Israeli security experts suggest that Iranians or Iranian-backed militias are indeed 20 kilometers closer. The Assad regime offensive in southwestern Syria may have almost completely wiped out the Islamic State presence, but that in itself could prove problematic. ISIS is leaving a hole that can be filled by another entity, maybe Syrian army troops, maybe Russian troops, or maybe Israel's arch nemesis, Hezbollah. Daniel Tzemach, i24NEWS.
Meantime, Iran's foreign minister was involved in some last-minute negotiations to preserve the Iran nuclear deal on the sidelines of the summit, the Asian summit in Asia.
Now, Mohammad Javad Zarif held several meetings with his counterparts from China, Russia, Turkey, and Japan. The summit in Singapore comes just days before Iran is hit with new U.S. sanctions that are set to take effect as a consequence of the U.S. pulling out of the 2015 nuclear agreement.
And for its part, China said that it is still committed to the deal.
We affirm that we will continue to maintain our shared position, which is that the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, can be preserved and implemented. Actually, we are not just safeguarding a single deal, we are safeguarding international law, safeguarding the solemnness and authority of international deals. It's a very serious issue. EU is very clear and steadfast on this issue, and China again affirms this point.
Meantime, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who is also at the summit, will not be meeting with his Iranian counterpart, but he did have crisis talks with Turkey's foreign minister. For more, let's bring in senior diplomatic correspondent Nina Larson. Nina, what's on Pompeo's agenda at the ASEAN summit?
Well, it's been extremely packed on day one. He's there for a couple more days, Tal. North Korea very much at the top of the agenda. He's really there to convince the Asian powers that the U.S. strategy on North Korea is moving forward in some way. He's basically also said to them publicly, you know, it's going to take some time. But you know, this is all part of that continuing effort to build confidence in this process that President Trump started a couple of months ago now. He also did, however, have a very key meeting on the sidelines of this summit with Turkey's foreign minister. As you know, there is an ongoing crisis at the moment over the fate of U.S. pastor Andrew Brunson. He's been detained in Turkey for a couple of years now. The Turkish authorities accuse him of being somehow involved in that attempted coup a couple of years ago that sought to oust President Erdogan. And Turkey is resisting any interference from the U.S. In that process, that legal process is still ongoing. And the result of that was the U.S. imposed sanctions on 2 Turkish cabinet ministers. Now, Turkey has threatened to retaliate, but nothing has happened so far. And the very fact that Pompeo sat down with his counterpart there really shows that they're putting some faith in diplomacy playing out before anything else happens.
Nina,